When we say modern, we usually refer to an idea of modernity or a temporal state of being predicated on the notion of time as an arrow moving in a single direction, and wherein the past once gone is not retrievable. Modern means having reached that state of being. But there is an alternative approach wherein the relationship between past and the present, between the old and the new, and between the traditional and the modern is fundamentally different. There is an Indian word for tradition, which gives us a clue. It's parampara. The etymology of this word itself is instructive. Parampara is composed of two root words, param, which connotes the superlative, as in param pujya, the most revered, or paramveer, the bravest, while para means the other in both spatial and temporal sense, as in paradesha, the other place or other country, other region, or parastri, a woman committed to another man. Parampara then together would mean that which is significant, to be revered, but it's not now, it's in the past. But such an understanding of past and tradition is not limited to India. I'm reminded of this wonderful observation by one of the finest poets of our time, T.S. Eliot. Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe, from Homer and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. This historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as the temporal, and of the timeless and of the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. The poet goes on to say, and this time with reference to architecture, and I quote, "The existing monuments form an ideal order amongst themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of the novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art towards the whole are readjusted. And this is conformity between the old and the new. The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past," unquote. It is this reciprocity between the past and the present, between the tradition and modernity, that marked the difference between Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi has never overtly expressed himself on the question of modernity or tradition in the sense that they concern us here. Still, there is enough indication in his entire body of work to decipher an underlying attitude to modernity, which may not have been consciously articulated, but it differs in subtle ways from that of his three Western ideals, Leo Tolstoy, Henry David Thoreau, and John Ruskin. Tolstoy opposed urbanization that accompanied modernism and said, and I quote, "In town, a man can live for 100 years without noticing that he has long been dead and has rotten away," unquote. Thoreau, on the other hand, was skeptical of the modern technology. He also wrote, referring to Walden Pond, that the villagers who scarcely know where it lies instead of going to the pond to bathe or drink, are thinking to bring its water, which should be as sacred as Ganges at least, to the village in a pipe to wash their dishes with, to earn their walden by the turning of a cock or drawing of a plug, unquote. And John Ruskin, with William Morris, founded the arts and crafts movement, opposed industrially produced things, advocated turning back to the handicraft traditions. Thus, while Ruskin, Tolstoy, and Thoreau preferred a simpler past over the modern present and rejected urbanization as a metaphor for modernity, Gandhi neither rejected urbanization nor industrialization. Instead, he assigned a specific role to both the village, which represented the past, and the city, either the present or the future, in production and distribution of goods on economic terms. As a representative of traditional India, the past and the present have a reciprocal relationship in his way of looking at modernity, not very dissimilar to what T.S. Eliot had said. This reciprocal relationship between the past and the present is clearly demonstrated in the house he built for himself within the Sabarmati ashram in Ahmedabad in 1917. He named it Hriday Kunj, abode of the heart. It is a good example to understand how Gandhi approached modernity and how his way differed from that of Tagore. Though the building's design is not attributed to any specific architect, there are several reasons to believe Gandhi himself to be the architect of this building. In the beginning of the 20th century, the term architect connoted referred to British architects such as Chisholm, Batley, Lutyens, or Baker. There were no Indian architects the way we understand them today. So how did the locals build their houses? The answer is the same way as in the pre-modern communities. Architecture was one of those knowledge systems which had been kept alive by local language and passed on from one generation to the next. A man who wants to build a house for his family would approach a mistri, a master carpenter or mason, who would follow the tradition with whatever improvisations that may be needed to suit both the client and the location. A generic spatial form has been arrived through traditional consensus and ingrained in the popular consciousness. A typical traditional Indian house can be diagrammatically represented by 3 concentric circles. The outermost represents the open terrace over or around the house, which is a place to sleep for the summer nights when it is too hot to sleep inside, but cool at night under the sky. And for warm, sunny hours of the winter, it is a place for women to do their housework and for children to play. In generic plan, this will be identified as either angan, falyu, or a chowk. The second circle represents the loggias or verandas, closed above to protect from sun and rain, but open on the side to allow all the breeze to come in. This is a year-round space for sitting, sleeping, or cooking and eating as shown here. The innermost circle stands for the closed spaces that resemble the conventional notion of a room, which is used when extreme privacies are needed or when it is too hot outside during the daytime in summer. The house then becomes the threshold between the finite world of man and the infinite world of nature. Gandhi also lived in similar houses before he went to England and then to South Africa. The 2 houses Gandhi lived in before he sailed for Europe show remarkable adherence to the generic form. There are 2 characteristics of these houses, though, that need to be noted. One, the spaces for occupation, referred to as ordo or room, is never attributed to any person for his or her exclusive occupation, like father's room or brother's room or a master bedroom or a guest room. Such attribution is a modern phenomenon and has emerged parallel to the emergence of the individual as a unique autonomous being. His or her identity was inseparably linked to that of the family or a community. A change from this would signal a shift from tradition to modernity. Gandhi's transformation of the generic form of the traditional house as Hriday Kunj demonstrates his conception of the relationship between tradition and modernity, past and the present, which is different from the one assumed by the European modernism. He also built his house with the help of a mistri, well versed in the traditional craft of making, but with a difference. He built a house that was modern in 1917, but with specific changes which heralded the new without negating the old. The modernity is expressed in the plan form, while the physical elements of the building stay traditional, thereby keeping it rooted and contextualized. We find all the spatial elements of the generic plan present, but in a new rational order. The rationality is expressed in both the spatial form, that is plan, as well as in corporeal and structural form. A significant departure is how all the components are grouped in plan and its structural order. The traditional linear organization, which we saw in the generic plan, in which the gradation of public to private spaces is determined by the proximity of this space to the street, is replaced by a U-shaped plan, offering a radically different interpretation of the public-private binary. An essential modern element is that Gandhi himself, his wife Kasturba, and his secretary Mahadev Desai all now have a specific room assigned to them. This is a radical departure from the traditional houses and is an unmistakable marker of modernity. It is in the spatial form that the past is conceptualized as a possible means of reaffirming or altering the present. The first indication comes from a clear distinction between the public and the private domains, signified by the introduction of the only wall along the entire width of the house. In addition to playing its usual role as a defining spaces, this wall also indicates a spatial hierarchy. On the front, the river side, northeast side of the wall, are placed the much enlarged otlo, the veranda, and Gandhi's own room, which would normally be called khadki or kacheri, office, a place for public interactions. Gandhi himself had placed his entire life in the public domain for the service of humanity. Thus, this interpretation of kacheri, office, with his own room on this side of the wall is both purposeful and also symbolic. It makes eminent sense. The otlo, the veranda, now acquires an institutional scale. It is large enough for small public gatherings with overlapping meanings. It is simultaneously an otlo, khadki, falyu, and angan, but covered on top with a roof. This is where Gandhi met not only many of his disciples, but also visiting dignitaries and his colleagues of independence movement like Nehru, Patel, Maulana Azad, etc. It is here in this partly open front of the house that the future identity of India was articulated. The body of the building is made of a series of wooden columns, walls and roof made with wooden trusses and covered with handmade earthen semicircular tiles. The appearance of the building has an element of familiarity, and at first glance, it may be mistaken as a traditional house. The columns are placed on a complex grid of multiple dimensions, determined mainly by the trusses and the geometry of the roof they support. The skeleton of the building, the bearing walls, wooden columns, and the trusses have an order of geometry and the integrity of this structural order, independent of the spatial order, which is immediately apparent. This is entirely new and is clear departure from the traditional. The king post truss, not part of the common local vocabulary, is a European implant and is an essential structural innovation here, as it radically rationalizes construction. The truss entails a certain structural discipline of equitable distribution of load, standardization of dimension, geometry, and a grid. A modern rational order indeed. The newness of the Enlightenment kind is the modernity of appearance, as it is proclaimed in the very physicality of the building, its visual and aesthetic appearance. The newness of the Hriday Kunj, on the other hand, is contained in its conception and not in its appearance. This conception is expressed in the plan. It's a vernacular modernity. It has been arrived at the same way it has always been in the traditional society. One man who personifies the Gandhian spirit of frugality and simplicity is the English architect Laurie Bakker, who made India his home and practiced architecture for over 50 years, primarily in a small southern state of Kerala. He was born in a Methodist Christian family, but later in life adopted the Quaker faith by choice. This early religious background may have made him receptive to the Gandhian values, which in turn had their origin in Tolstoy, Thoreau, and Ruskin. While Gandhi's sense of tradition encompassed the whole range from ancient philosophical wisdom to social institution and vernacular crafts, Bakker approached his task as an architect in the conventional sense by developing a formal vocabulary using locally available material from within 5 miles radius from the site, as suggested to him by Gandhi, and reviving and upgrading the craft and technology born out of these materials. The best way to describe Laurie Bakker is to call him an architect craftsman, a better trained and better organized artisan, a modern mystery. He adopted the traditional artisan practices of intimately identifying with the materials and letting them tell him what are the potentials in a given situation. In the process, he has not only learned valuable lessons about the wide range of design possibilities from a limited inventory of materials, but has also produced a body of work that is respected by the community. In some respect, he can be said to have succeeded from the mainstream architectural profession, confining himself to a small geographical domain and language limited to this land and society. It will then be futile to measure his work by the yardstick of aesthetic modernity of the academic kind. Still, his impressive body of work, and it's impressive, he has built more than 1,000 buildings in the span of 50 years. This body of work transcends this geographical limitation. His is the aesthetics of scarcity, of morality and ethics that has universal validity. For example, he has set for himself a 20-point code as a kind of moral compass to guide him. By showing innovative methods of using brick, wood, bamboo, and found objects, Bakker has modernized the traditional skills and also instilled confidence and pride among the local craftsmen. Like a typical traditional mystery, Bakker has executed most of his work without or with minimum drawings. His visualization seems less cerebral and more existential. He lays out his buildings on the site by an intense identification with the location, the lay of the land, the existing objects like rocks, trees, etc. His buildings often express this negotiation between the elements of the location and the human program. It is these negotiations that provide the logic of his plan forms. There is logic, but it emerges after the buildings are built and not before. It is futile, therefore, to look at his plans and expect to see a plan form, a symbolic meaning, or any representation of the transition from tradition to modernity in the academic sense. Plans in this sense are incidental to Bakker's architecture. The predetermined deliberative process of spatial composition is replaced by a greater reliance on the corporeal materiality and its expressive qualities. One of the cost-saving devices which Bakker has elevated as an aesthetic tool is bricolage. A French term, it connotes something created or constructed from a diverse range of things, often found objects. Thus, in Bakker's building, traditional elements such as columns and colored glass bottle replace the regular transparent glass and also bring filtered colored light inside. Discarded bicycle parts are used as window grills, and broken ceramic parts, pens, and colored stones end up in a beautiful mural. Bakker's architecture thus revolves around three primary issues: vernacular and locally available technology, low-cost construction, and what he refers to as anti-facadism. Explaining his architecture, he writes, and I quote, "As this mainly concerns our search for union with eternal, it seems particularly not right to indulge in a pretentious facade with these buildings. This anti-facadism has definitely been very noticeable and is a deliberate characteristic of Laurie Bakker's architecture, no matter what type of building is being designed," unquote. I believe when he refers to facade, he is referring to the modern proclivity for isolated autonomous building, an object in space with self-consciously designed external elements not in harmony with the surrounding environment. This simply frames this issue in moral and ethical terms. In many respects, Doshi's architecture transcends our conventional mold as a professional work and borders on spirituality. He himself has characterized his work as a search.
I am not an architect, that's the problem. For me, it's a search. It's only search. Search for that unknown which I have not known. Neither I know how it will manifest. That's actually the essence of my work. It begins somewhere, ends somewhere, and in that process I grow and the work grows. And we both grow together.
This mirrors Vedanta Darshanam, which declares that here the ultimate goal of life of all beings is moksha alone, that is the search for truth. Doshi's professional biography also contains clues to explain the trajectory his work has taken. Coming from a family closely linked to the artisanal activity of furniture making, Doshi belongs to that class of Indians who had continued to communicate with the world in the local languages and had responded to the winds of change to keep their crafts contemporary. Though he did enroll at the neoclassical Sir J.J. School of Architecture at Mumbai, he never completed the program and never received any structural academic training. Keeping with the tradition of an artisan learning his craft from the master, Doshi's intimation into architecture happened at the atelier of Le Corbusier in Paris, at a time when all of Europe was seized by the modernist frenzy of post-war rebuilding. And Le Corbusier was commissioned to design Chandigarh, the new capital of the state of Punjab. Later in Ahmedabad to oversee Corbu's work, he came in contact with a few enlightened individuals and scholars who grounded him in ancient Indian ideas and ethos. From early 60s, Doshi came in contact with Louis Kahn, and this association lasted until the death of the master in 1975. Thus, Doshi has been strategically placed to be able to actively engage with the current search for the new identity of architecture, liberated from his Eurocentricity, and also to help create visible images of India fast modernizing but still incorporating its traditional sensibilities. Doshi is a thoughtful architect, more in an intuitive than academic sense. His response to situations such as a site and its physicality or human institution is by recalling his past experiences and not by rational conceptualization. These past experiences invariably include growing up in a traditional society. One of his earliest projects was low-cost housing for the staff of Ahmedabad Textile Industries Research Association, ATIRA, in 1959. These were the years of acute scarcity of everything, including building materials, especially cement and steel, as most productions of this material went for large infrastructure projects needed for the development of the nation. Doshi's response to these restrictions was a cluster of houses built with parallel exposed brick walls, spanned by brick walls, or using lime mortar constructed by unskilled laborers. The internal arrangement was minimal but well lit, well ventilated, and dignified. Doshi thus turned scarcity into a source of expression of a poor society, but with traditional ingenuity. In 1962, Doshi started a school of architecture in Ahmedabad with two friends, Rasbihari Vakil, a structural engineer, and Bernard Cohn, a French architect, who left his teaching position at Yale University to join Doshi. Doshi also designed the building for the new school, which provides a good example of Doshi's negotiations between tradition and modernity, both for the school as an institution and its architecture. The site was an abandoned brick kiln where land was dug out to supply clay for making bricks. Making a virtue out of this, Doshi developed a spatial configuration full of surprises. The school is a series of places, mostly without doors, where ideas and activities flow and spill over each other, both physically and metaphorically. The plan is a variation of the traditional prototype of parallel walls spanned by concrete beams instead of traditional wooden joists, as the spans are much larger. For European modern movement, space meant volume contained within the physicality of a building, notwithstanding Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion. In India, space is never an objectified entity in the Aristotelian sense of the absence of the presence. The closest concept to space is referred to in Sanskrit as kshetra or loka, which can mean either a region or a field or a place or even a human body. And imagine always in connection with its occupation. It is both a place and what occupies the place. It is both the people and their behavior. It is both the object of perception and the process of perception. Doshi instinctively returns to this ancient wisdom to fill the campus with a series of kshetras of various architectural qualities, each with a subtle suggestion as to how it can be occupied. Louis Kahn might have termed this as what the place wants to be. Learning and generation of new ideas happen then, not just in the defined spaces such as classrooms, studios, or laboratories, but also in unexpected places, cool shaded places under the building, made possible by the lay of the land, conjure of images of sages engaging young disciples under the banyan trees, images still present in the collective cultural memories. What emerged as a response to scarcity in the Atira housing earlier, namely the exposed brick walls, became a more emphatic assertion of identity at the School of Architecture. A language is evolved within this massive exposed brick walls, with the concrete north light acquiring iconic status. Even though the school too was built during the time of scarcity, there is no hint of it here. Instead, what comes through is the image of a society full of confidence in its ability to innovate and overcome scarcity. Over the years, Doshi has designed more than 100 buildings and large urban design projects and has developed an architectural language which is not only both appropriate and modern, but also offers a powerful critique of the European model. His studio Sanghat in Ahmedabad, the Hussain Doshi Gufa, whose architecture draws from the ancient themes of mosaic tiles covered domes of several religious structures, and the Indian Institute of Management at Bangalore are notable amongst them. In recognition of this contribution, he was awarded the prestigious Pritzker Prize in 2018, the only Indian architect to have won this. A close associate of Doshi, for Anant Raje, also architecture was a spiritual pursuit. He sought the realization of the universal through the practice of architecture. Louis Kahn, in whose atelier he worked from 1966 to 69, and then saw the completion of Kahn's project for the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, has had a profound influence on him. Whether Raje's own spiritual pursuit drew him closer to Kahn or he imbibed it from Kahn is a mute question. What is important is that Raje, with deep-rooted spirituality, inherited from his own culture, found himself drawn towards the master like a shishya seeking out a guru. Those who have known Raje closely know of his passion, commitment, and the search for the universal in architecture, not very different from that of Kahn. Raje is often referred to as Louis Kahn of India. While this is recognition of his genius, but at the same time, I believe it is unfair to him as it prevents us from understanding him outside the orbit of Louis Kahn. Raje's adoption of the language of brick construction, at once ancient and universal, which Kahn had elevated to the contemporary level, was confined only to several new buildings he designed within the IIM campus after the master's death. These were buildings within the IIM campus in close proximity to the work of the master in the spirit of the completion of the master plan. Here, while he reverentially followed the language, vocabulary, and grammar of Louis Kahn, he also sometimes extended, in a subtle way, its boundaries, showing new possibilities. Raje's architecture is far more cerebral and deliberative and requires our intellectual engagement equally so. Plan, then, carries a lot of meaning in Raje's work. Raje has summed up this attitude to plan thus. There are several important lessons that I have learned from Kahn. The first has to do with the nature of an architectural plan. It takes a tremendous effort to make a plan because it is an abstract document within which a given architectural program may be seen. It requires an ability to synthesize the program in terms of plan elements so that there is a potential of placemaking rather than merely space making. It is this lesson and effort of placemaking that is reflected in most of my work from time to time. The architectural plan and building being made should have a proper sense of order, appropriate to and inherent within the choice of materials and their structural expression. If there is a stronger order within the plan, it leads towards the exercise of making of openings, the thoughtful makings of opening instead of just making openings that do not arise out of architecture or structural order. The buildings he designed are taut and rigorous geometric compositions with natural light as the structuring element in the plan form, space animated by light, visual polychromy achieved through a selective palette of natural materials for exterior surfaces and a systemic order of spanning openings. Arguably, the most distinguishing element of Raja's architecture is the innovative elements, which, for want of better terms, we shall call the pavilions. These are spatial elements, defined but not closed on the sides, with variable spanning systems, and occupy the corners or the ends of main building blocks. The course, the logis. This is a very important innovation Raja has made in his interpretation of the envelope, that zone of negotiation between the human program and the external environment with its myriad constantly changing forms. These are room-like but open to outside elements structures, mainly at the corners of various built components. Their genesis may be a combination of Khan's unbuilt project for the meeting house at Salk Institute, or the assembly building at Dhaka, or the domed pavilion Chhatris in Islamic or Mughal architecture. But Raja has reinterpreted this with a unique contemporary architectural order, composed of openings of various sizes, spanning system of lintels and segmental as well as semicircular arches. These are not places of habitation, rooms to be occupied for any human program. These are like ruins and belong to the realm of pure architecture. It was in the design for the Indian Institute of Forest Management at Bhopal in central India that this exploration reached its pinnacle. The plan is a composite of several buildings, each for a specific elements of the institute, such as faculty and research, classroom and library, seminar rooms, administration, auditorium, etc. However, these buildings are grouped together with a rigorous geometric relationship in such a way that the entire campus made up of these diverse elements has the feeling of wholeness. Subtle variations in the ground plane with a series of platforms at various heights further articulate the spaces reminiscent of Fatehpur Sikri. A series of pavilions placed at the edges of the building, some open to sky, others not, constitute the architecture of the envelope. These pavilions together form an order of spatial threshold, not only between the inside and the outside, but also between the private and the public architecture. If Charles Courier used the pergola to suggest the completion of the built form, Raja has invented a spatial element without which the architecture here remains incomplete. The openings of the outer face have the scale of the public, letting the windows of the use spaces inside be whatever their use demands. Architecture that is offered to the public domain is public architecture through the scale of its built forms and built elements. In the spatial form of the entire building, these pavilions provide the ordering element, the harmonic centers in a spatial symphony. They may have been inspired by Khan, but Raja has refined this with a delicacy of detailing reminiscent of Mughal architecture. For Raja, plan form embodies the core of his architecture. We saw earlier that for Laurie Bakker, the plan is incidental. It is instructive to compare these two fine architects' work and see them as foil for each other. Baker's buildings are exuberant, romantic, and melodious to conjure up a musical imagery. Raja's architecture in that sense expresses rhythm, harmonic structure, and rigorous order. If Laurie Bakker is Anton Vivaldi of Indian architecture, Anant Raja then is Johann Sebastian Bach. Like Khan, Raje too has avoided the historicity implied in the term modern. Remember, Khan used the term volume zero to place himself outside this historical progression. And yet still, as the designer of the Indian Institute of Forest Management shows, Raje's architecture is quintessentially Indian and modern at once. And so is the architecture of Laurie Bakker and Balkrishna Doshi. It was Gandhi who showed us that modern, after all, is that which is authentically new in its own time. The newness of the work of all these three architects, Laurie Bakker, Balkrishna Doshi, and Anant Raje, and that of many other young architects whom I have not been able to bring in here, is ideologically rooted in the rich and fertile cultural soil of India and her past. Past not that is left behind, but a past that is constantly being made alive and contained in the present. I'm again reminded of T.S. Eliot.
Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. If all time is eternally present, all time is unredeemable. What might have been is an abstraction, remaining a perpetual possibility only in a world of speculation. What might have been and what has been point to one end which is always present.